You don't pause because you have nothing to say. You pause because somewhere along the way, you learned that words have consequences long after they leave your mouth. You learned that silence can be safer than accuracy, and that timing can matter more than truth. So before you speak, you listen, to the room, to the air, to your own body, waiting for the moment that feels least dangerous. That waiting became so natural you stopped noticing it. You learned early that words carry weight. Not in an abstract way, but in a physical one. In the way a sentence could shift the atmosphere. In the way a tone could tighten your chest or soften it. Before you understood language fully, you understood consequence. You noticed pauses. You noticed emotional aftershocks. You noticed what happened after certain things were said, and what happened when nothing was said at all. Without realizing it, you began to slow yourself down. As a child, you were not necessarily quiet, but you were attentive. You listened past what people said and into what they meant. You noticed when emotions were already near their limit, when a question would land too heavily, when honesty would create distance rather than closeness. You learned to read the emotional weather before you learned to describe your own inner state. This is how a child disappears, not by leaving, but by becoming careful. No one sat you down and told you to hold back. There was no single moment where silence was demanded. It happened gradually, through pattern and repetition. Through noticing what was welcomed and what was not. Through learning that some feelings required translation before they could be safely expressed. You adapted the way children always do, not by blaming the environment, but by reshaping yourself to survive inside it. You began to think before speaking because thinking felt safer than reacting. Thought created distance. Distance created protection. It gave you time to scan for danger, to soften edges, to decide which version of yourself would be most acceptable in the moment. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. Your nervous system learned vigilance. Not the loud, panicked kind, but the quiet scanning that never fully turns off. You became sensitive to tone shifts, facial changes, emotional undercurrents. You learned that restraint could prevent rupture. That once words were released, they could not be taken back. So you held them. Without realizing it, you were regulating more than your own emotions. You were regulating the space itself. Absorbing what others could not hold. Carrying emotional weight that was never named as yours. This is sometimes called growing up too early, but it feels less like maturity and more like responsibility without consent. A subtle form of parentification. A child becoming the stabilizing force. You learned to pause, to edit, to filter, and the world rewarded you for it. You were called thoughtful, mature, wise beyond your years. People trusted you, confided in you, felt safe around you. But no one asked what it cost to be this aware, this contained, this composed. You didn't think before speaking because you lacked words. You did it because words felt dangerous when released without preparation. As you grew older, this adaptation followed you quietly into adulthood. It became part of your identity. Conversations turned into internal negotiations. You sense a thought forming, then immediately assess it. Is this necessary? Is this too much? Is now the right time? Will this change how I'm seen? You are not trying to be perfect. You are trying to be safe. Without realizing it, your mind learned to run simulations before allowing sound. There is a particular loneliness that comes with this. Not the loneliness of being ignored, but the loneliness of being perpetually edited. You are present, engaged, responsive, yet rarely fully revealed. Others experience you as calm and grounded. They don't see the constant internal movement, the weighing, the holding, the restraint it takes to release even simple truths. What saved you then now imprisons you. Because the same caution that once protected you now delays you. It keeps your truth slightly behind your awareness. You often realize what you feel after the moment has passed. Alone. In hindsight. When it's finally safe. You replay conversations later, not because you regret silence, but because you finally have access to what wanted to be said. There are moments when you notice how quickly other people speak. Not with judgment, but with quiet fascination. Their words arrive already formed, already external. Yours take a longer path. They pass through sensation, memory, implication, emotional safety. By the time they reach your mouth, they have been refined into something manageable. You don't envy their words. You envy their ease. Without realizing it, you learned to associate ease with risk, with the possibility of saying something irreversible, of revealing a feeling before it had been properly contained. Your body remembers that exposure once came with consequences: confusion, withdrawal, emotional distance, subtle disapproval. This is how memory lives in the nervous system. Not as images, but as timing. You notice it most when something matters. When you feel hurt, misunderstood, quietly disappointed. The more emotionally charged the moment, the slower your words become. You choose restraint over immediacy, calm over accuracy. Later, when you are alone, the words come effortlessly, fully formed, clear, honest. But there is no one there to hear them. This delay is not a failure of expression. It is an echo of early adaptation. As a child, you learned that emotional reactions could overwhelm the space. That adults had limited capacity. That your feelings needed management before expression. You sensed, without anyone saying it, that there wasn't room for your full response. So you learned to compress yourself. This is how a child disappears, not by becoming invisible, but by becoming manageable. In adulthood, this often shows up as being described as low maintenance. You don't ask for much. You don't react strongly. You don't create conflict. Others experience you as easy to be with. But inside, there is a quiet exhaustion. A sense that you are constantly translating yourself into something easier to hold. You think before speaking because you learned that truth requires preparation. That emotions need framing. That feelings in their raw form are not always safe to release. There is a particular kind of self-trust that gets interrupted here. Not broken, just delayed. You trust reflection more than instinct. Thought more than impulse. This gives you depth, but it also keeps you slightly removed from the present moment. You live a few steps behind yourself. You may notice it when someone asks how you feel. There is a pause. Not emptiness. Searching. Your system looks for the safest translation. The answer you give is usually true, but rarely complete. Without realizing it, you learn that truth must be timed. You often feel responsible for emotional outcomes. For how your words land. For how others feel afterward. You replay conversations, adjusting phrasing, wondering if something could have been said more gently, more carefully, more acceptably. This is not overthinking. It is attunement turned inward. Your mind learned to scan for impact before release. A form of hypervigilance that looks like wisdom. You are not trying to control others. You are trying to prevent rupture. Because once, rupture felt dangerous. Or final. Or quietly devastating. What saved you then now imprisons you, but gently. Invisibly. There are no sharp edges to this prison. Just constant self-monitoring. A sense that expression must be earned. And yet, there is dignity here. There is dignity in someone who understands the weight of words. In someone who knows that silence can be protective, not empty. In someone who learned this not from theory, but from experience. Your way of being did not come from nowhere. It came from adaptation. From intelligence. From care. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. And perhaps the quiet shift does not come from speaking more, or faster, or louder. Perhaps it begins with understanding. With seeing your pause not as hesitation, but as memory. As history. As a nervous system that learned how to survive through restraint. There is relief in that recognition. Not a solution. Not a correction. Just understanding. Understanding that your silence is not absence. Your slowness is not indecision. Your careful speech is a record of where you've been. And maybe, in that understanding, the pause loosens slightly. Not because it has to disappear, but because it no longer has to protect you alone. Just a quiet knowing that the way you speak makes sense.